Changqing, farewell to priest Ling. Secluded in its grove stands the bamboo forest temple. The sound of its bell comes muffled in the fading dusk, seeming to carry the last light on his straw hat. He returns alone into the dark green hills of night. So, moving on, we get to the last batch of poets by Liu Changqing. We've already encountered quite a few poems of his. He has 11 in this anthology, so that should put him, let's say, in the silver league of the poets represented in this book. There are some poets that have more than 20 poems. There are even some poets, two or three, that have more than 30 poems in the anthology. So they would be the gold league. Then you have poets that have between 9 and 19. And then finally, you have poets that have one or two poems, or three, but very few. So I think this number of poems pretty accurately depicts the critical perception of Liu Changqing. We've talked about him before. He is a Haitang poet. He developed a good reputation for being a very good representative of the Haitang style of relatively, sometimes even deceptively simple depictions of nature. And he was very well appreciated for that type of poetry. But of course, he paled in the shadow of more famous Haitang poets, even Haitang poets of nature like Wang Wei. You could consider him a silver poet of the golden age, so that would justify an important position for him in this anthology. He was specially reputed for his pentasyllabic verse, and we saw a lot of his poems in the pentasyllabic regulated verse section. Also, here in the pentasyllabic quatrains, he is the second best represented author. So Wang Wei had 5 poems, Liu Changqing has 3. If we also look back at the poems in this anthology, a lot of them, a very big percentage of them, are parting poems. So, pretty conventional, socially oriented pictures. In fact, of the 3 that are included in this section, 2, including the one we're going to talk about today, are parting poems. And as I said, it's also famous for depictions of nature. And that can be seen in this poem that we're going to read. Well, we've already read it, that we're going to comment. And then we can see it in some of the poems of his that we've read previously. So, farewell to priest Ling. We don't know much about the priest, but, or at least I don't know much about the priest. But this is the pretty standard poem of parting. Probably Liu Changqing has had a meeting with this priest. The world, we've commented this over and over again, just like in medieval monasteries, the monastic life, also the Buddhist or the Taoist monastic life, represents a cutting away, a separation from the world, especially from the world of political ambition and success, the world of the court. But it's not a complete succession because many of the monks are cultured, they read literature, they write literature. In some periods, they participate in literary salons in the capitals. So it's not uncommon for the scholar official in his free time to play the retired life, to play the life of a retired hermit. And it's not unusual for him or her, well, him, the scholar officials, to visit cultured Buddhist monks and talk with them while visiting Buddhist monasteries, and vice versa. It's not unusual for monks to indulge in some of the, you could say, frivolous pastimes of the scholar official gentry, like writing poetry, playing Go, Wei Qi, and dabbling in the arts. So what we have here is the aftermath of a meeting of Liu Changqing's poetic persona and this priest. Probably the priest came to Liu Changqing from his monastery, the bamboo forest temple that is mentioned in the poem. He is returning back now at nightfall. Now, poems of parting are pretty conventional. They usually include the sadness of parting and sometimes a philosophical reflection on the passage of time. When the person from whom one parts is a monk or is living in retirement, there are depictions of the secluded life, perhaps the secluded space, the mountain, the river, where the monk or the hermit spends his days in loneliness. So this is a short poem. It's a pentasyllabic trechu, ojueju. So there isn't much space really for much development. And nevertheless, the poem is quite intelligently crafted and well organized in its two couplets, as we'll comment in a minute. You could say that the two couplets establish two different parts. The first part, the first two lines, focuses on the temple to which Ling is returning. It's a temple that is placed in the mountains. It's there but not seen. It's heard but not clearly heard. So there's this emphasis on the difficulties of perception, or the deceitfulness of perceptions, which commonly appears in poems with a Buddhist background or with Buddhist figures. But also in poems like this about the secluded life, because it's the secluded life of the priest who's leaving. So he lives far away from the world, hidden from the world, hidden visually, but also hidden orally, in a place that is difficult to locate, difficult to find. And we've read many poems of even scholar officials trying to find a monastery or a hermitage and not being able to find it, but hearing some echoes, maybe a noise, a sound, some distant bells, through the mist, some path that leads probably to the hermitage or the monastery. And this is a very common image. Like, we don't have the path is lost, but there are traces of the path, which acts out also as a metaphor for the person who's still in the world, but feels a sudden pulsion towards the retired life, but is not that convinced to really follow that path, follow that way. So the first couplet depicts that hidden, that secluded space. It's exemplified through two images of not seeing and hardly hearing, to which priest Ling is meant to return. In the last couplet, the focus shifts from the place to which the monk priest is going, towards the monk priest himself, and we get a glimpse of him from the perspective, from the point of view of Liu Changqing, seeing him go away, getting lost among those dark mountains at night. So let's take a look at the couplets then. First couplet. Secluded in its grove stands the bamboo forest temple. The sound of its bell comes muffled in the fading dusk. So we get the part of day. It's dusk, the day is ending, the saddest part of the day, so the background, the chronological background emphasizes the tone of sadness, melancholy, metaphorical death that is generally present in almost all parting poems. And we have these two images. We have a physical space, so we have a chronotope. It's the end of the day. We don't have the season. And we're somewhere close to the bamboo forest temple, which is probably hidden in the mountains. Honoring its name of bamboo forest, it seems that the temple stands secluded in its grove, so probably it can't be seen from where the poet is speaking, and the bamboo forest that gives it its name forms a palisade, a grove that hides it away, that secludes it, that separates it from the world. The image of seclusion does not necessarily imply lack of sight, but it does clearly imply the separation. And the second line continues with an oral image. The sound of its bell comes muffled in the fading dusk. So there is a faint echo of the bell, but probably the temple is rather far away because the sound that comes is muffled, as if the fading dusk were filtering or hiding away the sound, which the dusk does not. But there is a little bit of a synesthesia here, if you will. Just as the dusk is hiding the light, it seems that the dusk is hiding the sound, is muffling it, it's silencing it. Whereas one would think, paradoxically, that the opposite would be true. That is, with greater darkness, it would be easier to hear sounds, because of the change from the prevalence of view, of sight, to the prevalence of sound. But anyway, both images, the secluded grove and the muffled bell, connote these images of separatedness, of closedness, of a space that is another space, a space that is marked off, that is cut off, that is separated from the world of the poetic persona. It's just this world of monastic life, of Buddhist retired life. Second couplet. Seeming to carry the last light on his straw hat, he returns, alone, into the dark green hills of night. So the temple is in the mountains, in the hills. So now we get the last glimpse, if you could say, the last subjective image that Liu Changqing experiences of this priest going away. He focuses on one slightly anecdotal element. So the setting sun, remember it's dusk, seems to leave a last trace of its fading light on the straw hat. We might imagine Ling is carrying a straw hat, poor material, a practical hat suitable for a monk living in the mountains. He might be wearing it, or it might be hanging from his back. But anyway, the sun hits on its straw, pale yellowish material, and seems to shine and to remain there as light is fading everywhere. It persists there. So that's also quite a metaphorical image. Like the last light goes away with the monk, and light is always a metaphor of illumination, of knowledge, which would be associated to something that is carried by a Buddhist priest, I imagine. And guided in a way by this last light illuminating his straw hat, the monk goes away into the darkness. So this darkness is the darkness of the hills, the darkness of night, which is creeping, the metaphorical darkness of parting, which always acts as a metaphor of sorts for death, for the final, irrevocable separation of people and friends. So into the darkness, into the darker darkness, into the dark green hills, Ling disappears. He returns alone, back to his monastery, back to his life, after this brief period in which he participated in probably the rather ephemeral social and cultural activities and conversations of the world. So the priest goes back to the mountains, and the poet remains to meditate, to think, and to make a poet of this situation. So quite a good poem. I enjoyed it a lot. I generally do not speak badly of any of the poems in the anthology, but I think it's a very well-made piece, which in very few words manages to encompass a lot of meaning. And I think it doesn't lose too much in translation. It will be better in the original, but I mean, it's still effective as a piece of literature in translation. And I am aware that this poem is probably one of Liu Changqing's most famous. At least it's one of the most commonly translated. This poem has been translated even into Spanish. I have a small anthology of Tang poetry, which includes this very poem. And, I remembered its topic from having read it elsewhere. So quite a nice work of art, a little gem.